In 1987, Prozac was brought to market, and this whole story with the smiling things that appeared on the news and all about low serotonin was done really as a marketing thing. It was a way to market Prozac as sort of a magic bullet, fixing a chemical imbalance. It was not a scientific story. So I don't know if there are any people in here that were ever told they had a chemical imbalance and low serotonin. That is a marketing story, not a scientific story. It's not a medical story. And by the way, see if I have this here, just so you don't think this is just me. This is a book called Essential Psychopharmacology, main textbook in the field, writing in 2000. Here's what they say about the serotonin theory of depression. There is no clear and convincing evidence that monoamine deficiency, that's a serotonin deficiency, accounts for depression. That is, there is no real monoamine deficit. Okay? Basically, and if you go to the schizophrenia hypothesis about too much dopamine, same story. They looked at the metabolites, they compared it to normal people, and basically the bell curve was the same. And so, for example, in 2002, also, Steve Hyman, he's the former director of NIMH, he's a neuroscientist, he's provost of Harvard University today. He writes in his book, Molecular Psychiatry, there is no compelling evidence that a lesion in the dopamine system is a primary cause of schizophrenia. So, is this optimistic or pessimistic? I just think it's, in some ways, extraordinarily optimistic. Because what we're really finding, what has happened here is, a couple things here, if I can put this in context. When you see great advances in medicine, so often they happen when you do identify a pathology, okay? And you identify a pathology, and therefore you can craft a treatment for that pathology. That's sort of the whole magic bullet thing, and it's the whole way we see many advances in medicine. Now, in a way, it's unfortunate that this has not happened in psychiatry. We just haven't had this breakthrough in understanding of what the biological causes, if there are biological causes, of mental disorders. They remain unknown. There may be some, but they remain unknown. Now, the optimistic part of this is this. People are told they have broken brains. People are told they have this chemical imbalance, and that's why they need to take the drugs for life. But that story is not scientifically true. And if people don't have this chemical imbalance, you can see the optimism is, well, maybe they can get through whatever psychiatric distress episode they're experiencing, and then get on with their lives because they really don't have a biological ailment that needs treatment forever. Okay, and that's the optimistic part, is that, you know, we have this thing, quote, the broken brain. In 1984, Nancy Andreas said people with mental disorders have a broken brain. That's not been found. Okay, and I think really that's part of the optimistic part of the story tonight. And then we're going to see a second part of the optimistic story. So in this book, I look, so once we understand that, I'm jumping ahead. So what do the drugs do? How do the drugs act on the brain? So we need to know the second part of the story. And let's look at Prozac again. Because sort of what happens to the brain was first fleshed out in some ways as Prozac was being brought to market. Okay, so what does Prozac do? Prozac blocks the reuptake of serotonin. Serotonin is kept in the cleft longer than normal. What does the brain do at that point? The brain, in this extraordinary adaptive thing, says, I have this normal process being interrupted, and I need to compensate for that interruption of that process. And the way it compensates, so the drug is trying to act as an accelerator on serotonergic transmission. What the brain does is it puts down the brake on serotonergic transmission. And it does this in two ways. The presynaptic neuron, at least for a time, they begin putting out less serotonin. And the other thing is the number of receptors on the postsynaptic neurons decline in density. These neurons are trying to become less sensitive to serotonin. Now there's a bit of an irony here. Before you were exposed to the drug, you really didn't have an abnormality. Now you do. And actually, you're now in the low serotonin state physiologically on this postsynaptic receptors. That's the irony of that. Now, real quickly with the antipsychotics, it's the same thing but in reverse. So antipsychotics block dopamine receptors in the brain, okay? So that's acting as a brake. So what does the brain do? It tries to put down the accelerator. The presynaptic neurons, at least for a time, put out more dopamine. postsynaptic neurons increase their number of dopamine receptors, especially these receptors called D2 receptors, which are the ones that are blocked. Such that if you look at a person who's been on antipsychotics for a long time at autopsy, you'll find that their density of their dopamine receptors is somewhere between 50% and 100% greater than normal. But that's a reflection of, that's a medication effect. Now again, you can see the irony here is the supposition was that people had too much dopaminergic activity. And now we have a brain that is trying to become super sensitive to dopamine in order to compensate for the presence of the drug. And again, think of this accelerator brake metaphor. Drug in that case acts as a brake. The brain responds by trying to put down the accelerator. Now, again, in 2005, Stephen Hyman, in 1995, Stephen Hyman, who was then director of the NIMH, summed up these years of research. And he wrote a paper called A Paradigm for Understanding Psychotropic Drug Action. He says, these drugs work by, quote, perturbing neurotransmitter systems. In response to that perturbation, the brain goes through compensatory adaptations. He says the brain is trying to maintain normal homeostatic, homeostasis is what he calls it, sort of normal transmission of messages. But he says, and at the end of this adaptive process, the brain is operating in a manner qualitatively and quantitatively different than normal. So the importance of this is this. We as a society believe that these medications are normalizing agents, right? They fix chemical imbalances. But if you really look at the science, they're actually abnormalizing agents. They're taking brains that we have no known biological problem, and in response to the drug, those brains change. Okay, you undergo these changes. Now, in and of itself, that may not be bad, because there's no reason that's necessarily bad. It's just a different paradigm. I do believe the minute you understand that, you say, well, maybe medication should be used cautiously, selectively, because, again, it's just not this fixing something paradigm. But there's two other things once you understand this. You can understand why medications have a lot of side effects. If they're abnormalizing agents, you can see why they disrupt a lot of functions, right? The second thing is, you can also see why it's possible they might be problematic over the long term. Imagine driving a car long term with one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator. The brakes, it's sort of going to get worn out, right? And you might worry that something like that at least happens in some people under this mode of care. Anyway, that's understanding in a very honest, down-to-earth way what we know about the biology of mental disorders. We don't. Those mysteries, they remain mysteries. Do people have chemical imbalances? No, that's not what we see. How do the drugs work? Well, they work in this way. And it's just a different way of understanding medications and what's happening with people that end up in this with a psychiatric diagnosis, okay? All right, in the book, as I said, I go through long-term outcomes for schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar. I thought what I'd do tonight is go through the long-term outcome literature for schizophrenia in more in depth, and then maybe real briefly look at the bipolar question, what's going on in bipolar. I don't think we'll have time to go into the children. I do that in the book as well. And obviously, all this is laid out much better, more thoroughly in the book, and if you go through that, I think you'll see how the evidence comes together. Now, why, in some ways, do I want to do schizophrenia tonight? It's because of this. If there's any medication that should show that has a good long-term profile, that it alters schizophrenia for the better, it should be this class of drugs, antipsychotics. Because we as a society not only are set up to insist that people in the hospital take these drugs, but also set up to insist that people in the community with so diagnosed take these drugs as well. So if that is so, there should be, I believe, from our societal point of view, clear and convincing evidence we're improving outcomes over the long term for the better, right? And by the way, in terms of the evidence base for antipsychotics, it's more thorough for antipsychotics than for any other class of drugs.